Okay, good morning, everybody. Are you able to hear? Is the sound
Yes,
okay?
sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
okay, very good. So we'll just get started with what we were doing last time. We are looking at the representation of floating point numbers in the IEEE floating point format. And we had said that this is one standardization effort which is has become very successful, used almost in every computer. The IEEE floating point representation is used, and we're just trying to understand the representation. There are two representations actually. One is single floating point format, the other is double format. The single format is 32 bits and the double format is 64 bits. In the 32-bit representation, one sign bit, exponent 8 bits, and the fraction part is 23 bits. And double sign 1 bit, exponent 11 bit, and fraction 52 bit. If we represent, it will be in this form. The first one is, of course, the sign bit. Depending on whether it is 0 and 1, it will be -1 or +1. And then we need to have this representation in a normalized form, 1 point some fraction, and then 2 to the power exponent minus bias. It's a biased representation, we'll just see that. And this 1 point fraction, so this is the full part here, 1, and then there is a binary point, implicit binary point, and then there is the fraction. But you will ask me that where is this whole part in the representation? We didn't show that, we just had sign, exponent, and fraction. Okay, the answer is that since it is always 1, it is not represented. Since the normalized representation, we have to have the significand here as 1. It is implicit, it's not represented. And therefore, it will be 1.00000 to 1.9999, and of course, there is a 2 to the power exponent minus bias. So the significand lies between 1 and 2. It can be 1.0000 to 1.9999. And since the leading pre-binary point bit is always 1, we don't represent here. We just add it when we reconstruct the number, and when we convert to this format, we just omit it. Now this bias, it is 127 in single precision format and 1203 in the double precision format. Now, why this bias? You just have 2 to the power exponent minus bias. So if your exponent is 0, you will have minus 127. Now let's just investigate a little further. Okay, I think we had discussed this much in the last class, but then here is a homework for you, that what is the advantage of having the bias? Please investigate. And those who come with some answer, please mail it to me. Why the bias? How does it help? Because if you want to argue saying that it increases the range of the exponent, because I want to agree, because in the we did not use the bias, then it will be both negative and positive numbers, and we will have to have the exponent in a 2's complement format. But now it is more of an unsigned number because of the bias. So how does it help? So we just take the actual exponent and add the bias to that. Makes all the exponent representation positive. That is obvious. But then how does it help? Why did they introduce this bias? That it helps represent larger exponent. I don't agree to that. So please think about it, do some study. Does it help and how does it help? Please send me your thought on that by email. And now let's do a few exercise. Represent minus 0.75 in floating point format. Notice the number minus here. So that means the sign bit is 1. And then if we represent 0.75 is 0.11. And to represent in 1 point some format, we apply an exponent of -1 here. So this is the representation, but then we have to, in the binary representation, we need to have the bias part in the exponent. We add 127 in single precision. So the sign bit is 1, okay, and the fraction is 1.000, and the exponent is -1 plus bias. Bias is 127, and that gives 126, and 126 we represent becomes this. And in double precision, it's almost the same thing, like appears very similar, just filled with ones and one preceding 0 and terminating 0. If you compute the binary representation of 126 unsigned number and 1022, you will get this. And now we have got all the three components, so we just put them together. One, the sign exponent part, and then the fraction part. And double also looks similar, excepting that it is larger. Now please do this exercise. Which number is represented by this representation? So the sign part, it's a negative number. And then this is the exponent part, but a biased exponent, and then the fraction part. So what is the decimal number represented by this? Please compute. Anybody can quickly compute. Sign is 1. If you are quickly able to compute, just unmute and tell me the answer. Otherwise, we'll just slowly go to the answer. So the fraction part is this one, 0, 1, which is 0.25, right? And the exponent part is 129. And if we represent that, it becomes 1.25. We added the implicit 1 here, 1.25 into 2 to the power 2, which is -5, -5.0. That's the answer. But normally in the tests, we don't give a straight binary number like this and then say that convert. Because we are doing it here just to understand or have a better appreciation that how it is represented. But giving a straightforward question like this will not serve purpose, because even the floating point calculators are available. You can just use these and get the corresponding number from the calculator. But we are doing this to understand how actually it is represented. Now let's look at this one. Minus 85.125. Again, trying to have the binary representation. And the sign bit is 1. And the integer part is 64 plus 16 plus 5, which is 10, 101 is the 5, the 16, and this is the 64, 85, and then 0.125 is 0.001. Now, when we write the number, it becomes 101.001, and we need to use the exponent to express this in a normalized form. And we find that we have to shift the binary point 6 places, right, 2 to the power 6. And now we have got it. Sign is 1. Fraction part, we got it. Wrote this down here. Exponent part is 6 plus 127 is 133, represented here. 128 plus 5. And then we have got our representation. Now this is the last exercise we are doing on this representation. 176.375. Those of you who can quickly do this, just let me know. How do we go about? Sign bit is 0, obvious here. And then 176 is 128 plus 32 plus 16. 128 plus 32 plus 16, yeah, 1011, and these are the zeros. 0.375 is 0.011. Can very simple one, just by looking at it we write the representation here. And then we need to shift the binary point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 points. So it becomes 1.011, and then this 5 zeros 11 to 2 to the power 7, and in the biased exponent becomes 134, and we represent 128 plus 6, okay, and then we just write it down, and that's the representation. Fairly simple for small numbers, just takes a minute or so. Gives understanding how we represent in IEEE floating point format. Please do few of this, because that will make you really understand how it is represented. And normally with 2, 3 or 4 problems, if you practice, it makes you understand and remember this format. But as I said, we don't really give you a number like this and compute and so on in the tests, because it doesn't serve too much purpose. Calculators are available. We give slightly more intricate problems. Now let's look at the special values. The ones that we saw just now, they are the exponent is 12254, and the fraction can be anything that is in the single precision. In double precision 122046, and the fraction can be anything. So this is what we saw. But then the exponent 0, all zeros and all ones, these are called as special values. When the exponent is all zeros or exponent is all ones, we don't really construct the number as we did. They have special meaning. If the exponent is 0, fraction is 0, then the object represented is 0. Okay. But what is more important is that when the exponent is 0 and the fraction is non-zero, we call it a denormalized number. Just now, in the next slide, we will try to understand what is this denormalized number and what is its purpose. And when it is exponent is all ones and the fraction part is 0, then this is a representation for infinity. Because sometimes during our calculation, we might get numbers which are extremely large and they are represented in this format. And if we, during our computation, we get some meaningless number, we represent in this format. All ones exponent and the fraction is non-zero, we call it a nan, or not a number. Now let's try to understand what is this denormal numbers. Look at here. Using the representation we had, the smallest number that we could represent is 1 into 2 to the power minus 126. That is this point here. Positive point on this arrow, this right side arrow is all the numbers we are able to represent. And then between 0 and 1 into 2 to the power minus 126, there is a gap here. We can't represent. And similarly, on the left side of 0, there is a gap which we cannot represent. The red one here, that is an interval we cannot represent. And if you get a value on this red line, you will get an underflow in your computation if we didn't have the denormal numbers, because we cannot represent that. The smallest number we can represent is 1.2 into 10 to the power minus 32. What about 0.5 into 10 to the power minus 32? Or let's say 1.1 into 10 to the power minus 38. Or what about 1 into 10 to the power minus 39? So all those numbers, if you get in your computation, you will get an underflow if you didn't have some way to represent those numbers. There is a huge gap here. For scientific computation, this is important actually. So the purpose of the denormal numbers is to close this gap. If you look on the blue line here, the distance between two consecutive floating points here is much smaller than this gap. I just request you to compute the distance between two points on this blue line and the distance of the interval of the red line. You will see that it is much larger than this. But how much larger? Request you to compute. And the purpose of the denormal numbers is to close this gap. And as we said, the denormal numbers, all the exponent bits are 0. And when all the exponent bits are 0, the hidden one is also understood to be 0. And not only that, the bias is 126. Instead of 127, the bias is 126. Now let's see how it helps. That the leading hidden bit 1, that is 0, and also the bias is 126. So whenever we see exponent is all zeros, assume that the hidden bit is 0. So it becomes this format. Whenever the exponent is all zeros, we have 0 plus fraction, and then with the sign bit, and the bias becomes 126. So if we have the fraction also 0, then it becomes 0 plus 0, and the sign bit, and depending on the sign bit, whether it is 0 or 1, we have two representations of 0.0. Don't really need it, but then that's the way it is, plus 0.0 and minus 0.0. But then what is more interesting is that the largest subnormal number, if we have the fraction, is 0.9999, etc. and 2 to the power minus 126. Then if we look at the smallest normal floating point number, then they are very close. So we have closed the gap. That's the purpose of d-normal numbers. If you get a number which is likely to cause underflow, because of this gap between 0 and the smallest number that you can represent, we use, or the computer uses, the d-normal numbers. Now the other special values are the infinities and the nans. Infinity is when the exponent is all ones and the fraction part is zeros. And is used if we want to avoid overflow, repeated overflows. And when it is all ones and the fraction is non-zero, it is not a number or nan, represents some illegal or undefined results. Now let's look at floating point addition. This you know from your school days. How do we add this? We need to shift the exponent so that they are aligned. That's the first thing we do. Remember your school days. But then which exponent do we shift here? Can we make 9.999 and 10 to the power minus 1? So shift the larger one, or shift the smaller one to make it 10 to the power 1. Option here. In manual calculation, we did not bother, but then here we bother. We shift the number with the smaller exponent. So minus 1, we make it 10 to the power 1 and it becomes 0.016. Can anybody take a guess that why do we shift the number with the smaller exponent? Why not shift the number with the larger exponent? Yes, anybody like to answer this question?
Sir, to prevent overflow, maybe.
Overflow. See, overflow is when the numbers are large that we cannot represent. But here only the fraction part we are changing. The number is not changing at all. We are adding the same number. What about? Yes, please. Who is answering? Yes, please.
So that the significant remains constant. It doesn't go to, for example, 9 to 10. It remains one digit.
Okay, not really. I don't really agree to that. Anybody else would like to answer? Shubham Karmakar. Any ideas? I mean, why do we do this? Shift the number with smaller exponent and not the other way.
Sir, no, sir, could not figure out.
Okay. Okay. So it's not hard to figure out. Just think about it. That do we lose anything? If we shift the larger one, do we lose anything?
So any kind of shift operation leads to loss of
Okay.
information.
Okay. You are on the right track, but why shift the lower one?
So that will lead to a lower change in the final value.
Okay. Okay. So I
Compared to
think you are on the
shifting.
right track, Divyans. You are on the right track, but request everybody to just explore this. Good. Please explore. I leave it unanswered here at the moment. Just said that Divyans is on the right track. And we shift the number with smaller exponent and then add the two significants. And then we might have this other than a single digit on the pre-decimal point. And then we make it normalized again and then round it and re-normalize, because we may not be able to express the precision that we're getting here. So this is typically the step in a hardware implementation. We're not going to really look into the exact way it is represented, but we'll look at the overall idea of the representation. This is an example of floating point addition, trying to add these two numbers in decimal 0.5 and minus 0.4375. This is the representation, the normalized binary. Align the binary point, shift the one with the lower exponent, perform the addition of the significants, and then normalize the result, and then round and re-normalize. And those are the steps we need to represent in the hardware implementation of the floating point adder. And as you can see, there are a number of steps. It's much more complex than the integer adder. And if we make all these computations that compare their exponent, shift the one with the lower, add the fraction part, the significants, and then renormalize and so on, it will take much longer than all the integer operations, maybe 10 times longer. And if we perform this in one cycle, then our computer will become extremely slow. Not yet discussed pipelining. That's the next thing in the agenda. Okay, not next thing, just next to next thing. We will pipeline this, but the overall representation, if we see, this is the one that we have these two numbers to add. The first thing we do is that compute the difference of the exponent, find the smaller exponent. This is the control circuit is doing that. Find the smaller exponent and then shift right the smaller exponent. And then perform the addition of the significants and then normalize and round. So there are four main steps here. And nowadays, see, in long back when we were teaching computer architecture course, we are actually showing this as the component level, that what are the gates and so on. But nowadays we don't do that. The main reason for that are the hardware description languages. designing has become much more straightforward than what used to be 20 years back. We don't really do this at the logic gate level. We do at this level because by using the hardware description language, hardware development has become like more of a programming. We just identify the components and write that we are using these components. This is not hardware description languages is not part of this course. Maybe you have done in some other courses, or maybe you will be doing in other courses. VHDL and Verilog that has simplified hardware development using a programming language like VHDL or Verilog. We just describe what is happening here at this level, and we get our circuit after we compile the Verilog or VHDL code. So we don't, the way we were teaching computer architecture 20 years back and now it has changed. We don't really go into the exact component or the logic gate level. We show at this level. Okay, so we'll see more and more details of the hardware that is coming up, but just as a precursor to the hardware that we are going to discuss, just said that not going to teach computer architecture that was taught 20 years back, where you used to see the exact logic gates and so on. Here we teach at this level, assuming that if you know VHDL Verilog, you can generate the code and you can synthesize the hardware from the code. The floating point arithmetic hardware is much more complex than integer. And the floating point hardware unit, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, reciprocal, all these need to be supported. And typically the floating point hardware unit is heavily pipelined. We will see more details of this as we proceed, but we'll leave this at this point and we'll go to the next chapter, which is chapter 4 in the book. And this is about the processor. We'll see how exactly the processor is designed, how does it work. So far we have looked at the instruction set architecture. We looked at the arithmetic operations, how floating point is represented and so on. Now we look at the details of the processor. But then this representation of the processor that we are going to discuss is a bit simplified. Doesn't happen that way because these are all pipeline nowadays, as I was saying. So we'll refine this basic representation of the processor with a pipelined version soon. That is after a couple of classes in chapter 5. But then you will say that why not directly discuss the pipeline version if that is what happens now? The answer is that this way we understand better. We first see how the different instructions need to be implemented in hardware. That's the basic idea. And then we look at what is happening now, the pipeline version. So far, we have looked at the instruction set architecture, and the CPU performance is influenced not only by the instruction set architecture and the compiler, because they influence the instruction count when we write the program for a specific problem solving, but also the performance is influenced by the CPI, cycle per instruction, and the cycle time. These are two major factors which influence the performance of the hardware. And as we discuss today, the hardware implementation of the instructions, we'll see that what will be the CPI, cycle time, what are the factors that are coming here and so on. So that's the focus today. Hardware implementation of the instructions we studied in the instruction set architecture. First, we look at the simplified or the basic implementation of these instructions in hardware. Then we look at the realistic pipeline version. We'll discuss the basic concepts in pipelining, because all processors now you see, starting from small embedded processors to large ones on server, all are pipelined processors. In last 20 years, that is one thing that has come and stayed. As I was telling you about the story that the Intel originally in the x86 Pentium processor didn't have, not Pentium, 386 processor didn't have the pipeline. And then it had the competitor in the form of Motorola. But then Intel went for pipelining their processor, got much more performance benefit, and slowly Motorola vanished. So pipelining is one of the crucial things that helps improve the performance of the processor. We'll look at that after a couple of classes. Now let's look at the different types of instructions that we discussed in the instruction set architecture. We discussed about the load word, store word for memory reference. We discussed about various arithmetic and logical operations like add, subtract, and or set if less than, and the control transfer instructions like branch equal to jump, etc. So for all these categories of instructions, we'll see what will be their hardware implementation. Now, before we start, just want to rephrase what we were discussing, that the register file in the processor has thousands of registers. And some of them are general purpose register in MIPS. We know what are the general purpose registers, and there are special purpose registers like program counter, instruction register, and so on. And we had seen high, low register and so on. Those are special purpose registers. And then see the red one, they are a large number of invisible registers, not visible to the instruction set architecture. We'll see as we proceed what is the use of these invisible registers. In the instruction execution, the first step, of course, is based on the program counter. The program counter is a special purpose register, points to the next instruction to be executed. So the next instruction is fetched, read from memory. That is the first step, get the instruction to be executed. And then the next step is to decode, find out what is the instruction. And then once we decode, we need to fetch the operands because they might be residing in the registers. So based on the register number, in the register file index, based on the register number, index into this general purpose register and then get the operand. So that's the next step. The third step, of course, is to execute, and for the arithmetic logic instructions, we just execute using the arithmetic logic unit. And for the load store kind of instructions, we compute the memory address, because this may be present in the form of some offset and some base register and so on. We use the adder to compute the exact address. And also for the branch type of instruction, we compute the branch target address. Remember that in the branch target address, we specify the number of instruction to be branched, because you need to add those trailing 0 bits to 0 bits. And also, it may be PC relative. We need to add the PC value to this, and so on. And then for the load store instruction, we need to store. So accessing data memory, we might have to read or store in the memory. So that we call as the store step. And then we increment the PC value depending on the address computed. If there is no branch instruction, just PC plus 4. So there are 4 main steps in instruction execution, very fundamental thing in instruction execution. All instructions will have instruction fetch, decode, execute, and store. So do you agree with me that all instructions will have these 4 phases: instruction fetch, decode, execute, store? Do you agree with me? Akshay Sai Reddy, are you there? Akshay? Arvind Jha, are you there? Raghavendra De?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you agree with me that all instructions will have these 4 phases: instruction fetch, decode, execute, and store. And do you agree with me?
Yes. Yes.
But then asking this question that do you really need to store in the data memory for all instructions?
No, sir, not all instructions. Like load and.
So that means you are not agreeing with me, because some instructions don't use this data memory to load and store, right? They
Yeah.
might be. Okay. Okay. So even though we said for all instructions, these are the phases, but some instructions may not have the store, but still we have a phase called a store phase. Even though some instructions, not some, actually most of the instructions, excepting the load store, none of the instructions has the store phase, but then to put them in a unified format, we say that all instructions do this: instruction fetch, decode, execute, and store or access the data memory and write in the register. For some instructions, we need to write in the register. So these are the main steps till the end of this course. And even if you study in a higher course, you will always find that this is what is written to make all the instructions have instruction fetch, decode, execute, store, and write back into the registers, because that helps in pipelining. As we proceed, we'll see that we need to have all the instructions in a unified format. Even though many instructions don't use store or load in the data memory, still we have a phase here because that helps in pipelining. Now let's look at the overview of our processor. We have written here instruction memory and data memory, but they are actually the cache, because the processor accesses from the cache. And based on the program counter value, read the instruction from the instruction memory or the cache, instruction cache. So that is the instruction fetch. And where does that instruction come here? Comes out here. And then based on that, we decode. And then find the registers, access the register file, and get the operands. And then use this ALU to compute the result, and for some instructions we store here in the data memory, and also we add 4 to the PC value, but then for some instruction we have this adder where we handle this jump and branch and so on. And then we use either this or this. And see here, there is another where coming out here, just coming to ALU. So what is the purpose of this where? Okay, the purpose is there may be immediate operands. They are not present in the register. One of the operand may be an immediate operand, and that is shown by this line coming out here. But then we don't really tie these wires like this, that this wire is tied here to this, and these coming out of this adders we tied here. It doesn't work that way. We need to select the specific line that is to be used. And how do we use that? How do we do that? We use multiplexers. So all the places where we tied the wires, we need to put multiplexers. Now let's do that. Okay. So we have put the multiplexers, and not only that, there has to be a control which controls that which multiplexer will be active, when exactly the instruction memory will give out the instruction, the register. So this is the overall control here through the control signals like write or read, memory read or memory write, etc. And also setting the multiplexers. All this is the work of the control, and all these blue lines, we call it as the control path. So the data path and the control path together form the overall processor design. We will see more details of this as we proceed from now. But before that, we need to just recapture some bit of the logic design. Many of you had course like digital electronics and so on, and some of you had said that they have read up, done courses and so on. Some had compulsory courses, but just to put you on a uniform ground, we'll just spend a couple of minutes just to refresh the basics. Low voltage is 0, high voltage is 1, and per bit we use 1 wire. And there are 2 types of logic elements we use. One is called as the combinational logic. Here, the output of a combinational element is a function of input. If we represent it in this form, we have several input bits are coming here. And depending on the value of these bits, we get some output. If it is an AND gate, OR gate, etc., all those are combinational elements, because based on the input, the output is uniquely determined by this function. It may be AND function, OR function, etc. But then we'll also deal with another type of logic gates, which are called as the sequential logic gates or state-based logic elements. And here, the output produced by these elements is not really a function of the input, because there is another input you can see. This is the memory. So depending on what happened earlier, that influences the result. Each time we give an input, we don't get the same output. It depends on something else, like what had happened, what is there in this memory. So we'll use these two types of basic elements to build our hardware, the combinational logic and the sequential or the state-based logic. The combinational elements, the examples are a AND gate, represent in this format. An adder is also a combinational element. We represent using this notation. Universally used, this notation is used across all books and literature. The multiplexer we represent in this way. And the multiplexer, depending on the select bit, either the I0 or I1, input 0 or input 1 is transmitted to the output, which basically implements the C functionality. The output is depending on the condition S or the select input, either input 1 or input 0 is assigned to Y. And an ALU we represent in this notation. You might see, you have seen already this notation. It's a very standard notation. We didn't tell about that time. And the F, see here F. F is basically what is the functionality the ALU need to do. Is it add? Is it subtract? Is it multiply? And so on. Now the sequential elements. As we said, these use some storage. They can store results. And then as the input, see this is a representation of a D flip-flop, which is a sequential circuit. And here there is a input here D, and the output appears when there is a clock here. We represent in this way. This is the notation. See here at the top we have the clock transitions, and depending on what is in the input, that is the D bits, at the clock rising edge, these are sampled and reflected in the Q. So the output of the Q changes immediately after the clock. Till the clock it does not change. So the output changes that we represent in this notation. So the meaning of this diagram is that on the rising edge of the clock, the input is sampled and the output is generated, and that is called as a edge triggered. We update the output when the clock changes from 0 to 1. Now, fundamental thing to watch here is that in combinational logic, depending on the input, it generates the output. But where will the output, what will happen to the output? If we don't store anywhere, it will get lost. And how is the input given to the combinational element? There must be some storage. So the combinational logic like ALU and so on, there must be some storage element, sequential element, which drives the combinational logic. And the output generated by combinational logic is also stored in a state element. Now, as the signal goes from the different elements in the logic, there is a delay. And the clock cycle is determined by the delay in this combinational logic, like ALU and so on. The longest delay among all the combinational logic elements determines the clock period. And this is the state element. Combinational logic drives the state element. So it gets from the state element and drives the state element. We'll stop here. We're almost at the end of the class. And as per the institute calendar, you have a small break on 20th Monday, don't have class as per institute calendar. So we'll again meet on Thursday and we'll not have the quiz on this Monday. That's a break for you. And after the Thursday class, we will have the announcement for the next quiz, that is quiz 7. Anybody has any questions, comments here? Please unmute and ask any question or comment.
Sir,
Okay.
quiz 7 is maybe on Thursday.
No.
Thursday or Monday?
See, Thursday we'll have a class. We'll have a normal class on Thursday. We'll not have a quiz. And we'll have the quiz possibly next to next Monday, because next Monday is a holiday. I mean, no class. So next to next Monday will be the quiz. We'll make the announcement regarding that. So that is quiz 7. Thursday, there is no quiz.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. In the absence of any other comments and questions, we'll just stop here. Thank you for attending the class.